Thank you, everybody. You are so lucky right now because you are in the right place. This session and these women are dynamite. I'm so excited. Sometimes a book, when you read it, is so necessary that you think, how could this book not exist? How is it possible that this book didn't exist? And that is true of both of the works that you're here to discuss. And my admiration for you both is immense. I feel a personal debt to what you've done. And so it's really a challenge for me to crunch together so much admiration into one short panel. I'm just going to do my best. What I will quickly come to first, I'm going to ask you both why this book needed to be written, because they are both necessary books. Anna, why was your book necessary?
Once I found out that Eileen O'Shaughnessy, when she'd married George Orwell, 6 months after the wedding, she wrote to her best friend a letter. And in that letter she said, "I'm sorry I didn't write to you earlier, but I lost my habit of punctual correspondence in the first weeks of marriage because we quarrelled so continuously and bitterly that I thought I'd just write one letter to everyone once the murder or separation was accomplished." So I had to know who she was, and I had to know why no one has ever heard of this hilarious and clever woman.
I cannot wait to hear you bring her to light, as you have done so beautifully. Katy, tell us about yours.
So my book is called The Story of Art Without Men, because in 1950, there was a very famous book called The Story of Art that was published, which was kind of, if you live in England, your introductory Bible to art history. I read it as a teenager and I loved it. And then I noticed something one time. I flicked the timeline at the back, looking for women artists' names, and I kept turning the page. And I realised that there wasn't a single woman artist mentioned in the story of art. So, just like Gombrich left out women, I thought I'd leave out men.
Hey, so much work to be done here. Yes, absolutely. A round of applause. So, Anna, I want to come back to you. And I just have to ask you first, because it's a deeply complex, it's technically brilliant, and it's a deeply woven piece of work. And when you first took this to your editor, did they say, how many books is this?
The book is woven. It has 3 strands because I'm a novelist and I write fiction and I also write non-fiction. And I could have written a novel after I'd finished my research and brought Eileen back to life. But a novel wouldn't have shown how she had been buried by the biographers of Orwell and by Orwell's scholarship and by Orwell himself. Because, for instance, she went to the Spanish Civil War, played an important role there, and he wrote a book about it, which you can read, Homage to Catalonia. I know, for instance, the first murder or separation letter, Orwell is about to go to the Spanish Civil War, and she doesn't tell her friend. When you think about that, you think she doesn't want the friend to descend upon her and say, you're being abandoned or anything like that. She's sort of curious about going herself. So I was able to write fictional scenes with the real letters in them. So that sounds like a complete dog's breakfast. And to answer your question, I think my publisher just sort of did a bit of that noddy thing, just kind of nodding. I think they had their sort of fingers crossed behind their back. And then it was, when she got it, it was okay. Yeah.
It's just seamless, and it's actually very thrilling to move between those threads. And we, of course, everybody knows George Orwell. We all love George Orwell. He was, of course, born, in Bihar. His first language was Hindi. We know that he worked in Burma as a sort of empire bureaucrat and hated empire machinery. So, and of course, it's had a massive resurgence recently. So there's a lot of love for George Orwell, and love that you share. However, in the course of rescuing Eileen O'Shaughnessy from oblivion, where she was willfully placed in a conscious act of erasure, you have to kind of throw old George under the bus. Sorry, George.
I'm not doing anything to George. I'm just telling the truth of what George did. So to say that I'm throwing some man under the bus is really to sort of shoot the messenger, really.
Fairs. Okay, I will absolutely take that. But I suppose what I'm looking at is you didn't throw him under the bus, but I can sense a conflict with you in that it's not easy. You say, for example, because we have to go to his sordid sex life and it's super depressing, and you say, I'm back at the door of the black box, not wanting to rummage around in someone's private life, but I have no choice. In there is where she lived. Tell us about the black box.
The black box is a metaphor of that operates in the book where it's like a magician's box, where, you know, there's a box which is like an upright coffin, and a woman. This is, for some reason, very common in my mind. I hope it's familiar to anyone else. But a woman stands in kind of a leotard and tights, and she gets into the box, and she's either going to be sawn in half or she's going to disappear. And the magician comes along and he does his spell and opens the box, and she has disappeared. So he gets credit for the trick of disappearing her. But when you think about it, she's done the trick, you know, and she's done it to herself. So I wanted to make this woman visible and make visible also the trick by which she's made to disappear. Private life is a very interesting concept. So I was briefly quite a bad lawyer in the 90s. I was too junior to do anybody any real harm. But when I was studying law, in Britain and Australia and the US, the law of rape only applied in public. So it didn't apply in the private sphere. So the law was protecting women on the street, and then once you were in your home and you were married, it did not apply. And I think that was the beginning of the end for me, because as a human rights lawyer, I just couldn't understand that once you're taken over the threshold as a bride, you no longer have the right to say no. You are deemed to have consented for your whole life. So a man is king of his castle at home, and that was a very dominant idea in Western law, you know. And so
I'm so glad that you left law.
Yeah, I left.
We are able to benefit from that.
But you feel awful rummaging around in someone's private life. I mean, the thing that really tipped me over the edge was when I was reading Orwell to sort of save myself. I was reading Orwell because he's so good at looking at how power works and who it works on. And I found myself at a moment of kind of overwhelm, domestic overwhelm, in what I later sort of termed wifedom, even though I was a white, privileged, perimenopausal woman married to a really great man. And so I was trying to work out what are the social forces operating on me that make my invisible, unsung wife work feel so enormous. And so I was reading Orwell thinking he would help me. And he kind of did, but he didn't mean to. At the end of this research, I found a private notebook that he was keeping when he was extremely ill at the end of his life. And he wrote in that, he wrote about himself in the third person, sort of to distance himself from his feelings, I think. And he wrote, "The thing that they don't tell you about women and wives is about how disgusting and filthy they are." And he'd only ever lived with one woman, that was Eileen. And how in any marriage of more than a year's standing, it's always the woman who wants sex more and more and more, and always the man who's trying to get out of it, aware that the more he tries to escape, the more she is vilifying him for his lack of virility, kind of thing. So when I read that so hateful a comment about essentially Eileen, that's the moment when I thought, do you know what? Your private life is where she lived, and I'm going to have to go there and have a look at this marriage and see what was going on. This marriage out of which these really important works came.
Yes, and I'm grateful that you were a failed lawyer, because the scruples that you showed as a lawyer are very evident in this writing. Indeed, you bring yourself and your life into the book, and we thereby come along with you, and we're inside it, so we sense the struggles that it costs you, and also in terms of your own writing life, which is absolutely fascinatingly woven in. But to return to that difficulty, that there has been some dismay or pushback from Orwellians. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, basically, I've had the most extraordinary... The book came out in the middle of 2023, and I've had extremely lovely, overwhelmingly lovely responses from men and women, and particularly from British men, actually, and Canadian men. I don't know why. Who have... One painted a portrait of Eileen and sent it to me, and it was exquisite. I should show it to you. And others. There is a small kind of fan club, really, of people associated with Orwell and the Orwell family, essentially Orwell's son and the son of his commander in Spain. And I travelled with these two elderly men at the beginning of my work to Spain. They take small groups around places that were of significance to Orwell. And I went on one of these tours, and it was fabulous. So we were in the trenches where Orwell fought, and we were in the streets of Barcelona and so on. But as Orwell's son and this group of... They're not scholars, they are essentially a kind of fan club. They are very attached to the myth of Orwell as a decent, upstanding, heterosexual man who wrote his work alone, who needed no help from women, and so on. And that's precisely the myth that this book explodes. So I think that has been quite difficult. Although Richard Blair, Orwell's son, has said that he thinks that his mother has been kind of undersung in history, and that she was much more involved with Orwell's work.
So I don't want Orwell to take over, because we need to break that habit. I must commend you for the technical brilliance of what you've achieved. But I also I would like you to give us a sense. I want you to give a sense of the complete woman of Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and a life accomplished, and some of the courage. I mean, you bring us to a devastating ending, which I won't tell, but just buy the book. But give us a sense of her life and her achievements.
Eileen was born in 1906 in South Shields in the north of London. She was head girl at her school and Dux. She was very clever, very charismatic, got a scholarship to Oxford in the 1920s, which was quite a rare thing. She read English at Oxford under Tolkien, who went on to write The Hobbit. So she was a very good writer. She was a very funny woman, and she was deeply interested in fables, in animal stories, and in writing herself.
Yeah, people know animal story. People know where that's headed, right? There was a little ripple there.
She was enrolled in a master's in psychology at UCL when she met Orwell at a party, and for him it was love at first sight. And he proposed to her about 3 weeks later, and she seemed to be having a kind of bet with herself. She told a friend, well, I said to myself, if I'm not married before I'm 30, I'll accept the first man who offers, and maybe this will be him. She took the word obey out of the wedding vows when she married Orwell. So a woman traditionally had to promise to love, cherish, and obey. She wasn't having that, so she took that out.
Right on.
But Orwell doesn't credit her with that decision. He wrote to a friend the next day, well, we had a service with a proper Anglican service, but the vicar left out obey. Of course, the vicar didn't do that on his own. Mm-hmm. That was an example. She went to the Spanish Civil War with him. She wanted adventure, and she worked at the headquarters of this left-wing political party in Barcelona while he was off in the trenches with lice crawling all over his pants, and bored out of his mind, really, trying to find a bullet to hit him which eventually did. But she was in charge of writing propaganda for this party and dealing with supply. She was extraordinarily brave in that war, and it looks like she probably saved Orwell's life, getting them out of Spain with Stalin on their heels. During the war in London, she worked to support them financially in the Department of Censorship in the Ministry of Information, which was the building in Bloomsbury that's sort of shaped like a ziggurat, and it's the building that Orwell later took as the Ministry of Truth in 1984, where his character Winston, as many of you will know, sits up there deleting the news, and that was her job during the war. At one point during the war, he decided, after their terrible experience with Stalin in Spain, that he wanted to write an essay critical of Stalin. And she, having worked in censorship, said to him, that will never be published because Stalin is currently helping us win this war against Hitler. So I know that that part of the conversation is true. What then happened is that they wrote a book together every night under the covers because they couldn't afford to heat the flat, which became Animal Farm. And it is this perfectly structured animal fable about Stalin that Orwell thought was his best book, and that his publisher couldn't believe he'd managed to produce and couldn't understand how it had happened. His publisher said, it's bizarre. There's a publisher who knew him and loved him and knew her, Fred Warburg, and he said, I don't understand it. All of a sudden, the writer of rather dour, grey novels has suddenly taken wings and become a poet.
How could that be?
Very head-scratching. Anyway, that's a very long answer.
And there's so much more. There's so much more that she lives through, and you really take us there.
One thing I would say about her is a friend of hers was a novelist. She had a lot of friends who were psychologists and psychotherapists, and also a novelist friend called Lettice Cooper, who worked with her at the Ministry of Food. A woman called Lettice Cooper. This is why I couldn't write it as a novel, because no one would believe some of these things. Lettice Cooper wrote Eileen as a character in a novel, a very beautiful character, and she said of her just this thing that I think is very telling of her character. When we first met Eileen, we thought she was affected because we would ask her a question and it would take her so long to respond. But then we realised it was because she was thinking about everything from our point of view, and she was thinking about everything and every connection. She saw through people's manners as if their feelings were glass. So she's someone who really saw people like a novelist.
And you can see that in the friendships and the relationships that she develops very generously. And I want to thank you for being such a generous friend to her, that we could meet a person like Eileen O'Shaughnessy. Katy, your book is a hurricane. You're a hurricane, and you've just whizzed around the world making people go, wow. You've described it as an impossible task.
It is an impossible task. I mean, this book should be about 500,000 times bigger than it is. And I always say to people, this is a story of art without men by me when I wrote it a few years ago. And, if anything, it's to get people to question what they've been looking at for all this time. The story of Eileen is so present in a book like this. I mean, told over and over again, and people, dismissing it and saying, why are you rinsing the man? And it's saying, no, we're just for once centering the woman, and that's okay. And the reason why I wrote this as the story of art without men is what I was so fed up of. It was everyone talking about women as if they could only be the wife of, the daughter of, the sister of, or the whatever. And it was to sort of root them in their social and political context and the time in which they lived, to sort of latch onto that. And there is no issue with just centering the women.
So you've both done this, monumental exercise in recentering important women. I sense that this book didn't kind of tap you on the shoulder. It kind of dragged you out the front door. Like there's a strong compulsion behind it, and you can feel that in your reading. Will you take us to the Linda Nochlin essay? Why have there been no great women artists? Take us to that as a moment from which things sprang.
So when I was 21, I had been a sort of lifelong lover of art and art history. I grew up in London, where many of the museums are free, and so that's what you do on a sort of Saturday afternoon. And when I was 21, I walked into an art fair, and I looked around me at all the works in front of me, and I suddenly thought, is there a single woman artist in this tent? And then I asked myself, could I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Could I name any pre-1900? And the answer was no. And so that night, I literally couldn't sleep. I went home. I did what any sort of 21-year-old millennial art historian, aspiring art historian would do. And I opened up Instagram, and I created an Instagram account called The Great Women Artists in response to a fantastic essay that was written in January 1971 by a trailblazing feminist art historian called Linda Nochlin, which questioned exactly that. So it was very much kind of, taking, hopefully, also paying homage to her, but also saying, here they are, because it's not like women artists didn't exist. They've always existed. It's exactly as you've been saying, it's who gets to write the story of art, which has left them out.
And you work chronologically. I mean, it really is an impossible task, because there will always be somebody going, well, why didn't you get, I'm sure you get a lot of that. I love the chapter called Taking Ownership. I love the 1970s. And I'd like you to introduce us to Judy Chicago and some of the movements of the 1970s and just what that energy was all about.
With pleasure. So Judy Chicago is this extraordinary artist. She's about 87 years old. She's still working in New Mexico. I spoke to her the other day. And between 1974 and 1979, she created a monumental artwork that is now permanently housed at the Brooklyn Museum in New York City. And it is a giant dinner party. It's probably about the size of this room, maybe a bit smaller. And it's a giant minimalist-like sort of triangle structure, as if to kind of put that triangular hierarchical structure on its side, but also to award women a seat at the table. And it honors 39 mythological and historical women from history, so from Sappho to Artemisia Gentileschi to Virginia Woolf to Emily Dickinson. And in the middle of it are the names of 999 more women from history and mythology. And, this was this task that was, she had hundreds of volunteers. It is made up of sort of, each woman has her own name place, and it's made up of ceramics and textiles to almost kind of use the needle as a form of protest. Think about the sort of great neoclassical hierarchies of what art should be. Painting and sculpture and classical architecture at the top, and what was at the bottom? Crafts and textiles and ceramics. And it's just preposterous, because first of all, that's immediately keeping women out, because I should say that women couldn't even enter the life room where they could paint the nude figure from life until the 1890s, where I live in England. But also, what did they have access to? They had access to the table, the domestic sphere. They made incredible lace. They made incredible textiles the whole time. So what Judy Chicago does is she rights that wrong, and she creates these incredible kind of Ionic-shaped name places. And the work was an absolute sensation. It toured around America, it came to Australia. 100,000 people, I think, went to the opening exhibition in San Francisco. But it took until 2007 for that work to find a permanent home, which kind of says it all, isn't it? Because it's all about, even though these women existed, it's about what opportunities they get, and also that opportunity to remain and have that legacy, and to have that place in a museum. Where I live in London, the National Gallery, just 1% of its collection is dedicated to women artists.
Still?
Yes. So when you go into the National Gallery, well, you just think women artists didn't exist.
So, but national galleries are one thing, but at the other end of the spectrum, there's folk art. That's always been made by women. And here in India, there's work by women, everywhere you go. And so why hasn't that been afforded the same visibility?
Well, I think it's precisely who's been able to write these books. It's the opportunities, and there were so many incredible women artists, and also the market. On average, women artists' work goes for just 10% of a man's, and in the 19th century, a lot of male art dealers would actually scratch out a woman artist's name and replace it with a male artist because it was easier to sell. So there's also sort of tons of stories of misattribution and scandal. There's a story that I talk about in the book about a work that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a great work of a portrait of a woman. And in 1917, the Met bought it for $200,000 when it was under the impression that it was by Jacques-Louis David, who was kind of, the preeminent sort of neoclassical painter. And then slowly people discovered that it was actually by one woman, and then it was by another woman called Marie Denis Villers. And it's that idea that these names, first of all, are not household names, but they've actually been scratched out. They've been, I would love to go back in time and ask these people who are writing, was it a conscious decision to leave out the women? Because if anything, you're just missing out on great art and great artists.
You really are. Yes, I was very happy to find Amrita Shergill in the pages, and she, of course, has a street named after her in New Delhi. So, I mean, I'm wondering whether it's a similar problem here. I certainly asked a few friends in Delhi last week, how many women artists can you name? And they rattled off loads. So perhaps your work is, having a... But, we have to acknowledge that there's a European slant to the work that you've presented because it was based off of a European perspective. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much sort of following Gombrich's story of art, but again, it's trying to break that lineage as well. I mean, like I said, I want this book, if you've never stepped inside a museum, welcome to the subject, and you can join it. And, you will understand it as well, because art history has previously been seen as this quite elitist subject with quite inaccessible language. And so it's to kind of get rid of all of that, and to sort of, again, with you, it's these biographies that have been published so many times all around the world, and suddenly you break that cycle by publishing that. And I think that's what I wanted to do with it, is kind of, veer off into different, 19th century Japan, India in the 1920s, Latin America in the 1960s, and make sure that I can fit as much as possible. But I also look at that book and I think, my God, I've learned so much more since. And so hopefully more volumes in the future.
It's a brilliant place to start, and I can't recommend it highly enough. You can open it anywhere, you can jump around. I mean, it's so accessible, so you've done a great thing there. Can I be a bit mean and ask, would you be sympathetic to artists who don't want to be called a woman artist and would just say, I'm just an artist?
Absolutely. The reason why I called it The Story of Art Without Men, as well as to kind of get rid of, I think men don't really like the fact that men is in the title. But I don't think we should have to label people like that at all. I mean, the reason why I called it The Great Women Artists then is because that's what I thought, but would I call it that now? I don't know. But in the sense that, there's people should be artists. It's about the work. There's so much work to do still. So we had these books, sadly, are still necessary.
And it's so important to keep having these conversations. And of course, you look at it now and you can see changes that you'd want to make, but that's all part of the process. That is the conversation. Can I ask you why art even matters in the first place? Is it just fancy paintings inside a fancy building?
No. God, it's so much more than that. I mean, art, the reason why I love art history so much is because it tells the history of the world through the individual who made that work. And, unlike other art forms, whether you're looking at a speech or you're looking at, a text that might be translated, art is so pure. That person made it in that exact moment. And so you take an artist like Artemisia Gentileschi, working in the 1600s. She had this extraordinary life. I mean, many of the artists who were working pre-1900 were able to become artists because their fathers were artists. So she grew up in his studio. Sadly, when she was 17 years old, she was raped by an artist friend of her father, and that resulted in an excruciating 7-month trial where she was actually tortured with ropes tied around her fingers and were tightened, which is obviously the most abhorrent punishment for an artist. And she made these incredible artworks that look at biblical and mythological subjects. So Susanna,
savage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Judith's and amazing. And whereas these women have been seen as quite passive in other artworks by perhaps male artists, she really centers the woman and she shows what life was like from a female perspective 400 years ago. And that is so important that we see that, because feminism wasn't invented in whatever it was throughout the 20th century, or that it's keep being reinvented now. That's a complete lie. Women have been fighting for their place forever. And so when I see that work from the 1612 or 1620, I think, my God, there was a woman like me who was at that time, and it creates an incredible conversation across time. And also I think one of the best things that I interview all sorts of artists, and Paula Rego remains one of my favorite artists, and she once told her son that an artist is someone who goes to a place where no one's ever been before, but brings back something that you instantly recognize. And I think that's the power of art, and that's what it can do.
Wow. I'm just going into a trance hearing you both speak. And we're going to have to let audience questions in because we won't have very much time. I want the microphone runners to be ready and super fast. Get your hands up, keep your hands up, and we'll try and whisk through as many as possible because I know there'll be lots. So pop your hands up now if you're ready for a question. Oh, you're not? You're a very shy audience. What's going on? Yes, here, and I'm obviously going to take a question from a woman first, so I'm glad for you, thank you.
I was just thinking about how much lost time there is to make up for in terms of the story of art without men, and how in recent years there's been like a resurgence of like lots of the greats having exhibitions, like Picasso, Gauguin, talking about the ways in which they were problematic. So it's like those exhibitions are happening before all of these exhibitions centering women. And I was just wondering if you could do away with the bureaucracy and the the patriarchal structures that are leading to these kinds of exhibitions taking place over other exhibitions. What would your salute like? What would you do if you could have your way with like the art world right now in order to make up for that lost time? What I'm sure you must have thought like.
Well, she wrote the book.
Yeah, like what would
yeah. I mean, you know, it's that idea of just making sure that people's voices are present. You know, if we're not seeing art by a wide range of people, then we're not seeing society as a whole. And if anything, you're just getting a narrow-minded image of what history was. And history was so much more, and it was so much more exciting than, you know, histories that have been written before let on. And, you know, it's interesting, when Françoise Gillot, who's an extraordinary artist, published best-selling books, amazing French artist, lived in America for most of her life, when she died in 2023, the New York Times ran her obituary headline that called her Picasso's mistress. Age 101 dies. I know I got them to change it, but it was sort of, how are we still, you know, contextualizing women in this way? You know, they went out for they were married for 10 years when she was in her 20s, and I'm totally with you. You know, we need to be centering. It's so much more exciting to be centering the women's voices and actually kind of lazy just fending them off as that, because they were so much more than that, and it creates a default that we shouldn't get into the habit of doing.
There's a lady in a beautiful floral with some glasses on here, please. Yes.
Hello. I just wanted to ask you, as you rightly said, women have not had the opportunity to express themselves. They've not found the spaces. But I was also wondering, you've done so much research, what is your sense of women imposing silence upon themselves?
That's a very interesting question, because it's very convenient. We all live in patriarchy. As far as we know, there is no other place. It's a very powerful story. And I'm always a little bit, I know that it can happen, that women silence themselves, but you have to look at what their situation is. To say a woman is silencing herself is attributing blame to her for something that may be much more likely happening to her, you know. And I think that for me it was very important to look at Eileen's life and not to use those excuses that are trotted out by patriarchy all the time. She wanted to do it. She consented to an open marriage. She was happy for him to be off with other women. None of that is true. Or actually a kind of Trumpian one that has come from one of the old Orwell society people. He wasn't erasing her, he was protecting her. So there's a lot of that goes on. I just wanted to say also, it's incredibly lovely for me to be in India talking about this book, because Orwell was born in India and it was very important to him. And one of the most important insights of his came from being a young policeman in India, because he realized that the empire was a system of despotism with theft as its aim. But
that's his words, isn't it?
That's his words, and that leads then to his insight, I believe, about doublethink. But even though he was brought up by a feminist left-wing mother with a feminist suffragette left-wing aunt, both of whom were really interested in women's liberation, obviously, and they were very literary. None of that, this is an erasure, you won't learn about his feminist upbringing by those women who came from mixed race family in India. You won't learn about that either in the books. That's all erased so that you get this white man who owes no women anything. But he was never able to apply that insight about colonialism that he learned here to the relationship between the sexes. So he had too much to gain, even though he had this feminist upbringing, by having a wife who would do all of that for him. And eventually there was a kind of coercion that set in, I think, even though she was such a feisty woman who started off not wanting to obey. So I think as women we need to look really carefully at this kernel of patriarchal entitlement that happens in wifedom.
We have one here.
Just another question on George Orwell. I'm intrigued. Did he, being sort of obviously a pretty bright man, I guess, in all that he did and wrote, did he never appreciate who she was in all your research and what she contributed to his life?
That's a question. So the last third of the book is sort of from his point of view. And the question that third of the book, it's a narrative about him writing 1984 and his situation and his illness. He was really writing literally on his deathbed this book that she had informed. Before she met Orwell, she wrote a poem called End of the Century 1984.
Ooh.
Projecting a future of dystopian mind control. And he, after the marriage is over, and he's then sitting there writing this book. So my question to myself was your question. Did he see her? In missing her, did he see her? And it put me in a very emotional state of mind when I was writing that. You know, his closest friend who loved him, Richard Rees, said he was a person who never really saw another human being. But he's married to this woman who sees through them as if their feelings are glass. So I think the work that we have, this great legacy of particularly 1984 and Animal Farm, we owe to the marriage, you know. It took two.
Well, you saw her, and thanks to that, we see her. More questions? There's one at the back, waving person. Keep your hand up.
I have a question for Katy. About that, you said that women artists always existed. Then what would be the reason for not existing people like you to record their contribution at that time or write about them if they existed? And then what are we doing correctly that they didn't do at their time to make the contribution more present?
So, if I may paraphrase, why hasn't a Katy book been written before? Like, why hasn't this been captured before?
What were they at that time doing wrongly that their contribution was not present so that this book came into existence?
So what was going wrong before so that your book had to be written?
No.
Sorry.
I'm asking about if the woman artist always existed, then their contribution was recorded back their time also. Then why that lost?
Oh, yeah. No, so why did it get lost? No, it's a great question. I mean, it's about, you know, who's been in charge of museums, who's been able to be curators, who's been able to have the opportunity to write books. I mean, you know, I was only able to sort of write my book in a way because of the internet. And if I'd gone through a sort of process 30 years ago, I probably wouldn't be where I was without that, because it sort of gives you opportunities that haven't been around yet. But I mean, you know, like I mentioned, Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the greatest Baroque artists working in the 17th century, she was so successful in her lifetime. People were so obsessed with her, they wrote poems about her, they commissioned work of her hand. You know, she was earning a great salary, but it's about what happens after those artists die and who gets to bring that legacy along with them. So it's about really who gets to write art history.
Thank you for your patience in letting us get to your question. And those filters, so there are so many filters that women's work has to come through and that women's lives have to push through. What filters are there now? Are they still very much present? And there were hands shooting up, so please keep your hand up if you... Yes, there's a blue hand that looks very urgent. Yes. In fact, ignore my question, because hers is, I can tell, is really important.
Right. We often...
Please stand up.
Yes, please. So we often understand the world in binaries, right? We can see that Eileen got eclipsed in the shadow of her husband. While the disrespect should not be erased, and it should see the light of day, I wonder if you'd like to, or if we can move forward in a narrative that rediscovers these wonderful, powerful women without giving any importance to their counterparts to ensure that they and only they get their entire due.
I'm not sure I've quite understood that one.
So I
Would you
guess,
like me to repeat?
Please, please.
Right. So we understand the disrespect that Eileen went through while being eclipsed by her husband and her contributions, right? I wonder if we can come up with an anthology or move forward with rediscovering these artists without giving any share to their partners who disrespected them.
Yes, I'm sure that there are, Katy will be able to talk about women artists who perhaps had unbelievably supportive partners. That wasn't the case in this relationship. So I was looking at Orwell and Eileen's relationship because I'm interested in the work, because the work is about tyranny and power and insight into power, but it's based on this enormous global and also very personal blind spot about the work of women. So I wasn't expecting to uncover all the things I did uncover about George Orwell. I'm not remotely interested in counselling him or throwing shade on him, because writers write out of their flaws as much as out of their, talents. And a flaw can be a talent. He was a sadist, so he's interested in sadism. He's interested in tyranny. He's a tyrant at home. So I'm looking at it in a much more complex way. You might want to talk about that in terms of art.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting, in the sense that who Eileen is within the context of Orwell, and there are so many cases in, last year I produced a series about Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, and I'm sure many people in this room have heard about Jackson Pollock, but how many people have heard about Lee Krasner? And she was also a sort of similar figure. She enabled his career. She got him the galleries. She got him, made him move to the country so he could make his work, and then he died, crashing his car with the woman he was having an affair with's friend. It's sort of insane story. And after he died, she was the one who also made sure that his legacy was cemented as well. Created his art market. And so I think it's such a complex issue, isn't it? Like, would we, know about Lee Krasner if not for Jackson Pollock? Or at what point, if you're a woman, do you kind of you understand that your place in the world, and in a way, maybe your place is almost at that time, you want to support that person who will have the opportunities.
It's very exciting, though. It's exciting. There's so much work to be done. And this is the last question, so make sure it's an absolute banger. Wait for the microphone.
I can project. Moment.
No, please, because I think if people are watching online, then...
All right. I have a quick question. I've been fascinated by your research process and where you found your sources and your resources from, because to find resources about her and her letters, where did they come from?
That's a good question. I've got just a tiny addendum to add on to what you were saying. Oh, that was loud. I feel like we're being eliminated on a game show. So my research process was very involved. I mean, I took 6 years to write this book. I was completely besotted with Eileen, and I couldn't believe what I was finding. So it started off in Spain with Orwell's son and the son of his commander. I was in the archive at UCL where I read his mother's diary from 1906 or something, where she's written baby's first word, beastly, which I thought was so Orwellian and wonderful. So the more I kept discovering, the more I, was absolutely besotted with the whole thing. I read 6 biographies of Orwell. So the 6 major biographies of Orwell are really, unfortunately for those biographers who are all men, standing in for my analysis of patriarchy, which is looking at how they write women out very deliberately. So the manuscript was typed, the visa was obtained, everything is in the passive voice. So no one is doing all of these things that are done, because it's almost as if in patriarchy men can't bear to attribute what they owe to women, who are, by their gendered nature in our society, we owe somehow all of this work and effort of love and care to them, and they don't owe it back to us. So, for instance, Orwell thought of himself as a decent man, but you can be a decent man without doing any work of caring for anybody. It just means you have integrity. But you can't be a decent wife or mother without doing that work. Amen. So I just wanted to look at the gendered nature of, so that work that Lee Krasner was doing is partly, maybe she's a nice person, but she's certainly a woman who has been gendered to owe that work to him, you know. And we are all in this, men and women, we're all in this gendered situation together, and the more we can see it, the more we can change it so that it's fair. Long answer.
I can answer your question quickly. Buy the book. Buy the books. I exhort you all to buy these outstanding books. One more huge applause for my brilliant
Thank you, Bee.
Anna and Katy.